Hi everyone, and today we're going to answer the question, why did the Ottomans never use plate armor? And to start off, I want to just say, well, they kind of did. In a sense, they of course never made use of full plate armor like these examples of Gothic plate, but this was not because of the fact that they did not see it as effective armor, or nor did they lack any expertise in making it, but it just did not fit the military culture and tactics employed by the Ottomans. They tended to use plate mail armor, like in these examples here. The question, however, is more complicated than you think. And so is the answer. Because to answer the question of the Ottomans not using plate armor in the years between 1400 and 1600, we have to look to way back of who the Turks are and where they came from. And I'm just going to keep it really short. The Ottomans, and in fact all the people who identify as Turkic, have their roots in Central Asia, an area known for its vast Great Plains. And for people who lived here, war was fought by horseback. Wearing metal armor was not common, and only the wealthy or the elite could afford the cost of heavy metal armor, which was mostly chainmail. The lack of armor also related with the capacity of the ponies that they used, as the small horses were not able to carry heavy burdens for long periods. This changed when Turkic forces started using Arabian, Turkmen, or Akulteka breeds, who, while obviously bigger than the Mongol horses, or the horses of the plains, was still not as strong as your war horses that you see in Europe. Obviously they have their own advantages, but they're not as strong or can carry heavy burdens as those European war horses. For most Turkic warriors, however, small shields, or the kalkan, were the only protection other than the thickness of their garments. To overcome this, they used the composite bow. In Turkic culture, horseback archery was used for hunting, for protecting livestock, protecting the tribe from outside enemies, and also thus for horseback warfare. And horseback archery created a highly mobile warrior. This mobility, which was necessary, cannot be hindered by heavy armor that you would see in the West. And thusly, in a kind of circle logic, the need and culture that developed around the bow as a true warrior's weapon meant that a knight in full plate would be unable to fire an arrow and wear heavy plate. This high mobility, low armor idea is an underlying principle used in many Turkic armies, which can be seen from the Magyars, Huns, Ongus, Oghuz to the Seljuks. These cultures settled in various areas around Central Asia, Middle East, and Europe, synchronizing and developing their own military traditions and affecting the cultures around them. One example would be the Byzantines using horse archers tactics when fighting against their enemies. By the time the Ottomans had established themselves as a force to be feared, even by the Mamluks, they had brought in various Turkic and Turkified strands of military history. For example, the Kapıkulu Süvari of the Sultan's household is effectively just a cataphractii of the Byzantines, who in turn were influenced by Turkic forces they faced earlier in the Huns and the Magyars. The Ottomans were great masters of combined armed warfare. They had to be. They needed to be if they wanted to face the extremes to the east and the west. Excluding their impressive military organization and socio-political organization, their religious fervor that was the start of the empire, and the logistics that they had developed, exclude all these things, if you just compared lightly armored horses and infantry, they would have a hard time with heavy armored infantry of the Balkans and Europe. And if they focused too hard on armored infantry and heavy knights, they would be destroyed by light cavalry such as those employed by Timur. So they needed something that was in between, that you could use for both, to use on both sides of their empire to fight Eastern armies or Western armies. The battles of Ankara and Kosovo show this significantly. There were growing pains in the empire who used this to develop their soldiers. In the Battle of Kosovo, they hadn't had a strong infantry corps developed yet, and we can see as in the early Ottoman battles in the area, huge numbers of losses. Even though the Kosovo battle was a victory for the Ottomans, it was a Pyrrhic victory, just because the Serbian forces they faced were very good, very heavily armored infantry fighters, and the Janissary Corps that they had developed wasn't ready yet to fight them. And when they faced Timur at the Battle of Ankara, they had forgotten, or not forgotten, but not effectively used or knew how to use anymore their expert cavalry, cavalry traditions that had developed, their horse archers, their feint tactics. All these things even though the Janissaries held Timur's forces, the failure of the horses caused the battle to be a failure for the Ottomans. Another fact was that the use of armor was seen as weak and unmanly, and whatever armor the auxiliary infantry used, for example the Yaya infantry, were picked up. So these Yaya infantry did not get any armor from the state like the household soldiers, so they used whatever they could find on the battlefield, and mainly protected vital areas: the chest, the head, shoulders and neck, maybe the legs. But they would use whatever they could, and it was common to see ill-fitting pieces applied ad hoc to where a soldier deemed. To overcome this problem of fighting completely different forces in the east and the west, they developed new strategies. They would keep their horse archers and the traditional cavalry, but they would mix it up with a solid defensive power and the shock value of their hard-hitting Janissaries. And their static defense tactics that they would use. They would also have their Kapakulu Savari, who are basically cataphracti, and using their light infantry to tie up the enemy, and using their heavy infantry. I'm using heavy infantry in quotation marks here because the Janissaries do not wear heavy plate armor. Their shock value was incredible on a battlefield to strike at the enemy and counterattack when needed. So no. Getting back to the original question, they did not use full plate armor like the European knights did, excluding of course their Serbian and their Balkan vassals and other European soldiers that they fought with them. They used something similar and almost as effective. They used the plate mail armor, or the chainmail armor with plates attached to it, wherever possible. And of course, one other reason that can be said as to why they would not use European armor is because they just did not care enough about Europe at the time, during the early periods of the empire. For much of the early years of the empire, the period they saw themselves as part of a rich heritage of Assyrian, Egyptian, Persian, Greek, Trojan, Roman, Arab and Seljuk empires, who these places had nothing to do with the so-called backwaters of the world, France, Germany, Italy. When the last crusade at Nicopolis happened, which was headed by Burgundian French knights, it barely registered on Ottoman history books, even though it was much of an annoyance and a wake-up call to them. So anyway, I hope this answers any questions you might have regarding that particular question. Hopefully one day I can make a better video on Ottoman armor. Possibly one day I'll buy a reproduction suit that you can and show you what each piece and what each piece does. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and make sure you like the video.